Phoenix was my home when I began working on the body toxic, and I started my research just down the street at the ASU library. My book was published in hardback a year ago and in paperback just a few weeks ago, and so it feels like I've come full circle now. There have been many promising developments in the past year that bode well for making the big change that I argue for in the body toxic, and that is reforming our country's badly outmoded federal laws that govern the toxic chemicals that are used in our everyday products. Tonight, I want to share with you why I wrote this book and then delve into what we know about the hazards and politics of bisphenol A, one of the 5 chemicals that I examine in detail in the body toxic. Then I'll talk about the opportunity we now have for reforms to the law known as the Toxic Substances Control Act, and the acronym for that mouthful is TSCA. And after all that, I think we'll have time for some questions. But before we do any of that, I just want to comment on the composition of the audience. It's a little more women than men, probably quite a few more women than men, and this reflects something that became clear to me really early on as I started researching the body toxic. Women in particular seem to profoundly understand the significance of the dilemma when it comes to toxic chemicals and health. As I've thought about the reasons for that, I think, because after all, this isn't really a gender-specific problem, but I think it boils down to this. Women pass on to our babies the chemical pollutants that pulse through our bodies. Our breast milk is contaminated with these pollutants, and some of us have experienced, as a mother, a daughter, or a granddaughter, the toxic legacy of diethylstilbestrol, or DES. This is a potent estrogen that was given to tens of thousands of pregnant women in the mid-20th century, so baby boomers and Gen Xers were affected. And it was given until doctors accidentally discovered that its use is associated with increased cancer and reproductive risks for the daughters, sons, and now even the grandchildren of DES-exposed women. And unfortunately, bisphenol A, a chemical used in plastics that I will talk about in more detail in just a few minutes, may be causing some of the same health problems as DES. So, as you heard, I come from an investigative reporting background, and in 2003, when I decided after 20 or so years it was time to write books and leave the newsroom, which makes me kind of look like a genius based on what's happening in newsrooms today, I was looking for a story that would inspire change and make a difference in people's lives. And my springboard into the topic of hazardous chemicals in everyday things came when I heard about work that the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention was doing. The CDC had started to measure the levels of chemical pollutants in people, and this is a phenomenon known as chemical body burden. So to measure chemical body burden, researchers use a really rapidly evolving and advancing technology called biomonitoring. And in fact, every few years when the CDC puts out its report on the chemicals its researchers are measuring, more chemicals are added to the list because the ability to measure them is growing. So the next report, which is due out before the end of this year, is going to provide data on about 250 chemicals that the CDC has been able to measure in people. And we know that there are more chemicals than that to be found in people, but this is what the most cutting-edge labs are really able to measure. What got my attention about biomonitoring and chemical body burden is that the chemicals that are found in people are things that we encounter every day, quite unwittingly, just by living our lives. Like many people, I had assumed that our regulatory system required chemicals to be tested before being used in our everyday things. But as I began to dig around, I soon learned that the vast majority of the chemicals that make our lives so convenient have not been safety tested because our badly outmoded toxics laws put commerce before consumers, and they don't protect the public. And as I thought about this, I realized that this was the story that I wanted to tell in a book. So I'm going to give you some examples of what I'm talking about and about why I think we need to be concerned. Let's start with the can of soup or the diet soda that you consumed today or yesterday or last week. The inside of the can is coated with an estrogen-mimicking chemical that's been in the news lately. It's called bisphenol A, or BPA. BPA also, and perhaps most famously, is in polycarbonate baby bottles and sport water bottles. And it was in the lining of aluminum SIG brand water bottles until the company switched the formulas of those linings in August of 2008. SIG was not transparent about this information, and it's paying a high price for its secrecy, and I'll talk about that situation in just a few more minutes. The FDA is now in the process of reevaluating the safety of BPA, and the FDA says it's going to be done with that safety assessment by November 30th of this year. But while the FDA has been pondering the safety of BPA, and this has been going on for several years now, 2 states, 1 city, 3 counties in the entire country of Canada have already instituted bans. And in animal studies, it causes breast and prostate cancer, diabetes, hyperactivity, and other serious disorders. And we know from the work that the CDC does with biomonitoring that 9 out of 10 Americans are exposed to this chemical. That microwave popcorn snack you munch at work and feed your kids, the inside of the package is coated with a grease-resistant chemical coating that breaks down into a highly persistent chemical called perfluorooctanoic acid, or PFOA. The Environmental Protection Agency is debating whether to officially describe PFOA as likely to cause cancer in humans. The CDC reports that 98% of the US population is exposed, and much of our exposures seem to be coming from food wrappers, such as microwave popcorn bags, and from pizza boxes and fast food wrappers, and all manner of things that would be grease resistant. That TV you sit in front of when you're not reading books that you purchased here at Changing Hands, it's probably made with a neurotoxic flame retardant that can affect normal thyroid development. These flame retardants are showing up in breast milk of American moms at rates that are about 100 times the average of what is found in European studies. And that makes sense because we've used so much more of this chemical in our country than in other places in the world. So I could go on about more commonly used chemicals, and I often do, so you probably don't want to sit next to me at a dinner party. But I think you're beginning to get the picture. Every one of us has traces of toxic chemicals in our bodies, and much of it is coming from our everyday stuff. And I might add that these chemicals cross the placenta so that a developing baby receives his or her first exposures in the womb. In fact, it's very cruel and creepy, but a mom's chemical load will decrease during pregnancy and breastfeeding because she's essentially mainlining the pollutants in her body straight into her child. So if we're all walking around with this stuff in us, and we're all living long lives made easier and more convenient by these miracles of modern chemistry, is there really a problem here? Well, I want to read you a few paragraphs from the Body Toxic that sum up the answer to that. For years now, it's been well understood that the risk of developing an environmentally related disease depends on a combination of exposures, genes, age, sex, nutrition, and lifestyle. And we all know that lifestyle choices such as diet, smoking, alcohol use, exercise levels, and UV exposures can influence our genetic susceptibility to health problems and diseases. But some of the newest research is suggesting something about low-level exposures to certain substances that is not so well understood. Since the beginning of the chemical revolution, manufacturers have held fast to an axiom in toxicology that the dose makes the poison. One of the 15th century fathers of modern medicine came up with the concept, which means the higher the dose, the greater the effect. In other words, trace levels of contamination like those found in body burden studies aren't worth worrying about. So in large part, chemical manufacturers have shrugged them off. Just because we can detect a chemical doesn't mean there's a problem, said Carol Henry, a vice president for the American Chemistry Council. As a result, regulatory toxicology, often conducted by chemical companies themselves, focuses on adult health effects, such as cancer and obvious signs of organ damage at high dose exposures. In contrast, research toxicology, primarily conducted at independent university and government research centers, studies low-dose exposures, which cause more subtle alterations of bodily systems that regulate such things as organ function, sexual development, behavioral cues, intelligence, and reproductive systems. Mounting evidence suggests that tiny amounts of certain chemicals can wreak havoc with hormones that shape our bodies and behavior over a lifetime. These chemicals are called endocrine disruptors because of the tricks they play with the complex physiology that controls basic systems of the body, from fetal development through adulthood.